everybody. Sorry for the technological challenges here. I am just delighted we have got Christopher Preston here. He's got the mic at the moment. Let me actually take this here for a second. So that the folks in Zoom land can hear me here. And so I'm delighted to welcome Christopher here. We have a couple of students who are going to be introducing you here, and we'll get started with your presentation. I'm going to go ahead and use the share screen here and get that, make sure we're working on that. That's still not showing over there.
I think when you go into slideshow, it'll start showing.
All right, well, we'll get that started here. Let's go ahead and get our introducers up to the microphones here. You know, we got Abigail and Mark, and then we'll get the rest of this underway. And then Abigail, to make sure that green light is on there.
I think I got it. Tonight we have the honor of hearing from Professor Christopher Preston. Dr. Preston is a writer and professor of philosophy here at the University of Montana. He grew up in England and moved to the United States in the 1990s. Since then, he has spent most of his time in the Western states. Dr. Preston received his master's in applied ethics from Colorado State University. From there, he went on to receive a PhD from the University of Oregon. Today, his research centers around the idea of the Anthropocene. Specifically, he is interested in climate engineering, biotechnology, and rewilding, and the impact that these technologies and practices have on the human-nature relationship.
And beyond the biographical and educational aspects of Dr. Preston's history, he's also an esteemed author, beginning around the start of this century with seminal and foundational works in epistemology of environmental philosophy. This was closely followed by numerous scholarly works, ranging from a biographical treatise to many works concerning ethics and philosophy, conjoined with evolutionary engineering, solar radiator management for the climate, and multiple anthropocentric publications, to and including the present work on wildlife recoveries, due in 2022. In addition to Dr. Preston's work in migration, climate change, and a broad range of ethics associated with these disciplines, this brief synopsis scarcely scratches the surface of his input in his fields of endeavor. And all the while, he teaches a full course load here at UN's Philosophy Department. From our readings, it is also apparent he likes to have fun. So please give a hearty welcome to the Montana course for Professor Preston.
Yeah, so if I go slideshow, that seems to work. And can you all hear me? My mic is on, I think. That's good. And Zoom people should let us know if you've suddenly lost the video. So thank you very much for that very kind words from both sides of the room. Really appreciate it. It's nice to be here in front of people. I haven't seen enough of that this semester. Before I start, I want to say something about my title. The word rewilding suggests biology and conservation. So I am going to talk a little bit about wildlife biology and conservation. The word Anthropocene gestures towards geology. So I am going to talk about geology a little bit. But what I really want this presentation to be about is philosophy. Do you think we need to move the mic back a little bit? What I really hope, I'll just keep talking to see if that you can get rid of it. That's better, isn't it? Better. Okay. What I really want us to get at is philosophy here. So when it gets to the Q&A, I think people are going to be tempted to say, I have a wolf question, or, I have a beaver question. But when you ask a wolf question and a beaver question, think about the philosophy that I've talked about, because that's actually what I want us to really think about in this conversation. So I said there'll be a little bit of geology. So let's start with the geology. We're in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the age of man, or the age of humans, right? The Anthropocene is the time where human impacts are now across the globe. So the idea here is we don't call our epoch the Pleistocene anymore, characterized by the expansion and recession of glaciers. We don't call our epoch the Holocene, characterized by that stable period of climate in which human history took place. Instead, we call our epoch the Anthropocene, the human age, because our impacts are everywhere. Now, what sort of impacts are they? You know this story. You know the story about climate change, about temperature change, about the nitrogen cycle, the impacts on species distributions, methane in the atmosphere, PCBs on the landscape. Those impacts are global, and those impacts are largely irreversible. So that means we're in the Anthropocene. Now, I have a little twist on this story about the Anthropocene. And the twist is to say, it's not just that we're in the human age, it's worse than that. We're in the synthetic age. The synthetic age is the birth of a new epoch in which technology, and this is technologies from nanotechnology down at the very micro level, all the way up to climate engineering at the atmospheric level. This is the age in which technologies start to reshape the world, not just impact the world, as we've done accidentally over the last few centuries, but deliberately reshape the world from the atom to the atmosphere. So I call this the synthetic age. Synthetic age is like an Anthropocene on steroids. And the characterization of it is that we don't do it by accident, we do it deliberately, and we don't do it just superficially, we do it metabolically. So metabolically here means getting inside the earth. Look at that guy on the bottom right there, getting inside the earth and changing how the earth works. So I've used this term, the synthetic age, and I've written a whole book about the synthetic age to characterize just how much control over the earth humans now have, potentially. But when I wrote a book on the synthetic age, I ended it with a story. It was a story of a grizzly bear attacking and killing a person in Yellowstone. When my editor saw the book manuscript, they said, whoa, why are you talking now about grizzly bears killing people in Yellowstone? You've been talking about nanotechnology and biotech. Why are we now talking about people dying in Yellowstone? And I said, there's a reason we're talking about people dying in Yellowstone. And that is that however much we think this is the human age, wildlife speaks back. Wildlife stops us having complete control of this planet. So if you like, what wildlife and the possibility of rewilding presents is the last barrier, the last way of stopping this synthetic age. And so that's how I got interested, after writing a book about technology, that's how I got very interested in wildlife, because what wildlife can do is it can kind of pull us back from the brink that these technologies have taken us towards. So we're standing on this precipice, and wildlife can pull us back. And this is an emblem of how wildlife can do that. Does anybody want to guess what we're looking at here? We are looking at Chernobyl. So we're looking at an abandoned building in Chernobyl. So think of nuclear power and all the potential nuclear power has. Think of how massive those power stations are. Think of the people that came to live in this city to service this power plant. And then something goes wrong. Something wild happens. and then that place gets abandoned and a fox crawls in. So this is sort of an emblem of what I'm talking about tonight, how wildlife pushes back against the synthetic age. So that's my geology part of the talk. Let's switch to the ecology and wildlife bio part of the talk. Rewilding. What is rewilding? So I like this definition. It's by a British guy, George Monbiot, who has an even more peculiar accent than I do. George Monbiot has a lot of stuff packed into this quote, but I just want to highlight a couple of things there. Resisting the urge to control, allowing nature to find its own way. So that's people kind of stepping back. So this is like a human nature thing that rewilding changes. Reintroducing. So it's a little bit active. You sometimes go in and you reintroduce stuff when you're rewilding. You reintroduce sometimes plants, sometimes animals. Sometimes you go in and you do stuff to let natural processes recover. So you pull down fences. You take those drainage ditches and you re-block them up again so that you start getting floods again. And you otherwise step back. So there's a lot of different things going on when you rewild. It's to do with animals and plants. It's to do with processes. It's to do with deliberate interventions. And it's also to do with stepping back and just seeing what happens. And with that, I want to introduce a distinction between two types of rewilding: deliberate and spontaneous. So deliberate is where humans go in and you say, all right, let's rewild something. Let's sort of put in place something. Let's make something happen. Deliberate rewilding. Spontaneous rewilding is the one I'm really interested in tonight. Spontaneous rewilding is where humans do nothing and nature just shows up. So literally we blink and nature arrives by itself. And that's where I want us to focus. And I want us to focus first on that spontaneous rewilding through the return of the wolf. So a lot of you will have heard a little bit about the return of the wolf. And perhaps most famously, you'll have heard about the return of the wolf to Yellowstone. I'm not going to talk about Yellowstone. Why not? Because with Yellowstone, it is deliberate rewilding. You see in the bottom right there, you've got people bringing the wolf to Yellowstone according to a certain plan. 31 wolves were brought back to Yellowstone in 1995 and 1996, but it was deliberate. So what about this? Spontaneous rewilding. This is the rewilding that took place in Glacier starting in 1986 when wolves started to cross the Canadian border by themselves and started to breed in Glacier without any intervention of humans. So this is the kind of thing I do want to talk about, is the spontaneous rewilding. But I want to take the conversation about spontaneous rewilding a little bit further. So here's a map of the first few spontaneously rewilding wolves in Montana in the 1980s or so. So you can see they just spill down the mountains from Glacier. I mean, that's kind of what you would expect them to do, right? Those are the first few wolves and the first little bit of tracking of those wolves. But I'm actually more interested not in those wolves, but the ones that have started to show up in places like Miles City, Glasgow, Judith Gap, Hammond, and the ones that will start to show up more and more in places in Montana. So these are spontaneously rewilding wolves that are showing up on our doorstep. You know, there's only so much we can learn from looking at Glacier and looking at Yellowstone. What about when you look at the outskirts of Missoula or Bozeman or Billings maybe, or Havre? Then things start to become interesting. Now, to learn some of those interesting lessons, I want to take a trip away from Montana for a while. So I know this series is about Montana, but I want to get away from Montana for a while. I want to go to Europe. So Europe is where I'm from. And there's a lot of very interesting spontaneous rewilding going on in Europe at the moment. So the reason the spontaneous rewilding is going on in Europe at the moment is that parts of Europe are depopulating. And all that map shows, or the bit that's interesting for our purposes, is it shows in green the parts of Europe that are depopulating. And as those parts of Europe depopulate, it creates opportunities for species like the wolf. And that is exactly what has happened. As Europe has depopulated, the wolf has come rushing back in to fill these gaps. And if you look at that map on the right is from 2014, but you can see those wolves spilling over into Western Europe from Russia, from Poland, from the Ukraine. Wolves literally in the last 15 years have been flooding into Western Europe. And just to sort of bring out the striking nature of how that has happened, I want to follow one particular, or a pair of countries here, the Netherlands and Belgium. So could you confidently point to the Netherlands and Belgium on this map? Somebody nod. Somebody say, yeah, totally. Could you point to England? Okay, so go to England, the yellow sort of taller island there, and off the bottom southeast corner, just go straight across the channel, across the North Sea, towards that pink and purple part of Europe, right on the coast there, the Netherlands and Belgium. The Netherlands and Belgium are interesting for two reasons. One, they're the furthest west in Europe, at least on that sort of main continental block. They're the furthest west. And two, they're incredibly populated. So if you look at those numbers there, you can see the population density in Montana compared to the population density in the Netherlands. 1,069 people per square mile in the Netherlands compared to 7 in Montana. Look at the size of the Netherlands, 16,000 square miles compared to 146,000 square miles. And importantly, no wilderness. Not a place that has a Bob Marshall, or not a place that has a Selway Bitterroot. Really, it essentially has farmland. And yet, wolves showed up. Wolves spontaneously showed up in the Netherlands. The first one in July 2013 in a place called Little Geest. And if you look at where Little Geest is, it's not even on the border of Netherlands and Germany. It's actually in the central Netherlands. Amsterdam, if any of you have ever been over there, I'm sure you've all heard of Amsterdam. Amsterdam is at the bottom of that little red bean shape that is Flevoland. So we're talking about a wolf showing up right in the center of Netherlands in 2013, spontaneously. Now, I happen to know the person who was charged with doing an autopsy on that wolf, Hugh Jansman. And Jansman put the wolf in the back of his car, and since then he's done autopsies on a number of other wolves. And with some pride, he says that he's had more wolves in the back of his car than any other Dutch person alive. He probably has. He actually found that that wolf on the side of the road in Little Geest was not a naturally returning wolf. It's a really weird story. It was a wolf that had come from Poland in the back of somebody's car. So how did they know this? They did an autopsy on it. They looked at the isotopes in the food that they found in the wolf's stomach. And it turned out that the isotopes were from a Polish beaver. And they're like, wait a second. How can you have a wolf in the Netherlands that has a Polish beaver in its stomach? It turned out that the wolf had also been shot and not hit by a car. And so it turned out that this was actually a hoax. So in 2013, the wolf did not spontaneously come back to the Netherlands. But in 2015, the wolf did spontaneously come back into the Netherlands. And the first wolves started showing up right, that's the border there, the border of the Netherlands and Germany. The wolves started crossing the border and they started getting seen on camera traps. They started occasionally taking sheep from various farms. And within a handful of years, wolves were settled in the Netherlands. So in 2019, they actually confirmed wolves as being settled there. So not just like nipping over the border and coming back, but settled in the Netherlands. And the first pups appeared in 2019. In that, for the Netherlands, is one of their most wild, most remote places. It's called the Veluwe. And it's a little slightly higher. Nothing in the Netherlands is very high, but it's slightly higher, slightly more wooded, and there's heather there as well. So that's where these wolves have started to breed in the Netherlands. Let's just go a little bit south of the Netherlands into Belgium, because wolves showed up in Belgium shortly afterwards. That same biologist tracked wolves. If you can see enough of that map, that track there on the left, wolves came from Germany into the Netherlands, south into Belgium, paired up. One of them became pregnant. So here's the pioneering wolf that became pregnant, ended up unfortunately getting killed. So that first pregnant wolf in the Netherlands got killed. The army was then enlisted to protect the remaining wolf. So the remaining wolf is in the Netherlands, just lost its mate, just lost its soon to be born pups. And in perhaps a fit of pique, that remaining male wolf killed a kangaroo. There aren't that many kangaroos in Belgium, but there are kangaroos in people's backyards, people who like to keep them as pets. So in Belgium, like in the Netherlands, the wolf had a slightly halting initial return, but then after a while, they settled in, they started to breed, and the population started to increase. So this is a map that reports on the wolves, how wolf populations are doing in Europe. Every single status trend on the right of that chart says that the wolves are either increasing or stable. There's one exception. Down in the bottom, there's a small population of wolves in Spain, which appear to have become extinct. But every other wolf population in Europe is stable or increasing. One really striking example is Italy. Look at where wolves were in 1900. They were through most of Italy, and then they were depleted through the 20th century until in 1973, there were just a couple of tiny patches. But in the 70s, a ban on hunting wolves was put in place. And just look at the explosion of wolves. 1999, 2010, 2020. This is spontaneous rewilding. All the Italians have done here is ban the killing of wolves. And the wolves do the rest themselves. They spontaneously rewild. And you can see on that map of Italy, the wolves eventually spill out the top of Italy, and they go into France, and they go into Spain. And so that is what has happened. You've got wolves spilling out of Italy. You've got wolves pushing through Germany into the Netherlands, into Belgium. You've got a large population on the Iberian Peninsula there, down in northwestern Spain. You've got this phenomenal recovery of wolves. Now, I have a little video clip of some of these wolves, which I wanted to show, but for some reason it doesn't appear on this photo. I don't really have a pointer, so I'm going to point with my finger. These Italian wolves have headed north. They've spilled out here. They've wrapped around the Alps a little bit. And these wolves over here are called Dinaric wolves. And these Dinaric wolves have spilled up this way towards Italy. And these Italian wolves have bred with those dinaric wolves. This is spontaneous. What you've got is you've got two subspecies of wolves in Europe breeding with each other for the first time in a couple hundred years, and they've done this all by themselves. This has been a spontaneous type of rewilding. Now, I said I'm going to go to Europe before coming back to the United States. Let's start to come back to the United States because there's some lessons to learn here. Europe has half the land area that we do in the United States. It has double the human population, and it has twice the number of wolves. You have to exclude Alaska there. Alaska skews the number a little bit because there are plenty of wolves in Alaska, but come south from Alaska into the lower 48. In Europe, you have half the land area, twice the human population, and twice the number of wolves. And those wolves are finding ways to live amongst people. So, what does that demand of us here in the United States? So this map has the historic range of wolves, and you can see that wolves, the historic range here is what color is that? Sage color? Thank you, sage. The historic range of wolves is basically all the way through the United States except in the southeast. So, wolves were widely dispersed in the United States. The current range of wolves is mainly Alaska, Canada, and the Northern Rockies. That's kind of what you'd expect. These wolves are starting to kind of creep back into the Northern Rockies. But as that current range starts to expand into potential habitat, we find ourselves asking, well, okay, we know roughly what the historic range was. How wide can that potential habitat go? How far can these wolves actually expand? And what I want to suggest from the lessons in Europe is that they can potentially expand quite a lot further than this map suggests. Okay, so look at that map. The light green is the currently occupied habitat. The dark green is the potential habitat. Is anyone here from California? No one's from California. You can all find California on the map though, right? Go to the California coast. Okay, look at the California coast. Do you know where San Francisco is on this map? It's right around here in the Bay Area. Okay, go south of San Francisco, and pretty soon you get to Santa Cruz. Keep going south, and you get to Santa Barbara. Before I came here today, I looked on a wolf tracking website to find where the latest wolves are in California. And there's a wolf called OR93 that is in San Luis Obispo County in California as we sit here tonight, which is just incredible. So this wolf, I've been keeping an eye on it for the last couple of weeks. This wolf has been in Fresno County. It's been in Monterey County. It's come through the Central Valley of California. It's now on the California coast between Santa Cruz and Santa Barbara. Okay, if you look again at this map, no one on this map says anything about wolves being on the California coast, but they are in fact already, at least this one, OR93, is already on the California coast. So what Europe teaches us, and what wolves are now teaching us, is that this potential habitat might end up being a lot more extensive than perhaps we think. Now, how does that affect us in Montana? If that wolf habitat were to become more extensive than we think, those wolves would be expanding east from Montana, first into eastern Montana, but then potentially elsewhere into the Dakotas and maybe even beyond. So I think Montana is a real sort of interesting spot here. And shortly, I'm going to start to get philosophical on you. Montana is a really interesting spot here because it has something to teach about cohabitation with wolves. So let's start asking some questions about what is involved in cohabiting with wolves. Now, you've had a speaker in this lecture series who's told you quite a bit about cohabitation with wild animals. Bryce Andrews was in here a few weeks ago. I was watching from home. I really enjoyed listening to him. And Bryce told you all about flaggery, the use of shaky, shiny flags to keep wild animals away. He could have talked about sheepdogs. This is a Maremma sheepdog, a breed actually, coincidentally, that comes from Italy. And it's a breed that is 2,000 years old. So for 2,000 years, Italians have been using Maremma sheepdogs to keep wildlife away from their sheep. You could use electric fences. You could also use range riders. And so there's a whole lot of techniques you can deploy in order to cohabit with wolves. And the people who deploy those techniques are people like Bryce Andrews. So do you recognize that photo of him there? I tried to pick a photo that, was representative of how he looked when he was in here, but he had a mask on, so it wouldn't have been so easy to tell. But there's Bryce Andrews working for people and carnivores. There's a bunch of techniques that you can use that helps you live with wolves. Here's another organization, National Wildlife Federation, that has a conflict resolution arm. And what that conflict resolution arm does is it helps people learn how to live with wolves. Now, I said that I'm a philosopher, and a lot of this talk is going to have philosophical goals to it. So what else does it take to live with wolves? Yes, you need the flags. Yes, you need the electric fences. Yes, you need the sheepdogs and the range riders. But what else does it take? Anybody know who that is? It's a philosopher.
Descartes.
It's Rene Descartes. Now, I was talking about wolves a couple of minutes ago. Why am I talking about Descartes now? Anybody know any of the things Descartes was famous for?
Animal abuse in under the name of science.
Mind-body dualism. Is that a voice coming in through Zoom?
There are several students on Zoom.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I was a bit confused where that voice came from. I sort of thought, it's amazing.
8 students on Zoom.
Okay, thank you, Zoom students. I appreciate your jumping in there. Ray, thank you. Mind-body dualism. Here's something Descartes said. I think, therefore I am. So that's Descartes' most famous sort of line. I think, therefore I am. And what I think, therefore I am said, or what it meant is, I, a human being, I think, I have thinking substance. Therefore I am. I know I exist because I'm a thinking thing. Even when I doubt I exist, I'm still a thinking thing. So I think, therefore I am was Descartes' line. And from that line, he came up with this idea that there's mental substance and there's physical substance. So this is the dualism, the mind-body dualism that was just mentioned. We're made up of 2 sorts of things, the physical stuff and the mental stuff. Now, once you've got that mind-body dualism going on, animals don't have the mental stuff. And so the Zoom voice that kind of beamed in from above a couple of seconds ago was saying, Descartes had this idea that he could experiment on animals live without worrying about what they felt. Why? Because they're just machines. They're just physical things. They're just material stuff. They don't have minds. They don't have souls. They don't have feelings. If you get too far down that road, you start coming up with distinctions like the distinction between the wild and the civilized. The wild is full of physical things like wolves and bears and mountains. And the civilized is full of intellectual beings like humans who have rationality and have this sort of elevated ability to analyze things. And then if you go that far, you don't have to go too much further before nature becomes effectively dead. Now, this doesn't mean there's nothing alive in nature. What it means is when you think about the natural world, you should only think about pure physicality. You should never think about life, vitality, soul, intellect. So you can see this path that Descartes took us down. It's a path that separates us from the wild world, including the wild world of wolves. So what if I said rewilding gives us a chance to improve upon Descartes? Do you know what's going on in this picture? There's more going on in this picture than meets the eye. What do you think we're looking at? Yes, we're looking at someone's domestic pet, a dog, interacting with a wild wolf. And this was a wolf called Romeo that showed up outside of Juneau, Alaska. I think it was about 6 years ago now. And for some reason, this wolf loved to hang out with dogs. And it showed up on this frozen lake. And when people realized there was a friendly wolf there, they'd go up there with their dogs on the weekend, and they'd let their dogs go play with the wolf. And the wolf loved to play with them. And it would interact with them. It would tear around. It wouldn't really come anywhere near the people. It wasn't really interested in interacting with people. But it had a real personality. And Romeo spent a whole summer interacting with people's dogs and became a real celebrity in Juneau and Southeast Alaska. Now, how can Romeo help us improve on Descartes? Well, here's one thing Romeo can do, is Romeo can persuade us to revisit that dualism that says, well, only humans have mental substance and everything animal is just a machine or just alive. I mean, Romeo was a character, and Romeo had in him animacy, so Romeo was animated and animate, and Romeo was one heck of an individual, a remarkable wolf that showed incredible patience around people and around people's dogs. So Romeo is pushing us away from Descartes towards a different sort of understanding of what wildlife is. And we can keep going with that understanding. We can go even further. We can recognize that wolves are not just animate and individual, but they are cultural beings. Now, I've got a couple of friends in the Netherlands. I keep mentioning the Netherlands because I had a position over there for a few months, a couple of years back. And this is one of my Dutch friends who specializes in wolf ethics and wolf reintroduction. And he said this to me about 6 months ago, and I haven't forgotten this. This seems like a really important observation. He said, the wolves arriving in the Netherlands now, they're different wolves from the ones that were eradicated 150 years ago. So these spontaneously rewilding wolves have a different culture. They have a different way of behaving. They have a different way of interacting with people. And so this is part of his argument why, the myths about the wolves from the past, we have to replace those myths with things that are more relevant to the wolves of the present. These are new wolves. So we need to recognize that wolves have cultures. There's lots of people studying wolves now, and the more you study wolves, the more you know that the wolf is not exactly like we thought the wolf was at the time when we were busy exterminating wolves. Wolves are intelligent in ways we couldn't have imagined. They're social in ways that we couldn't have imagined. They learn things in ways that seem far beyond what we thought any animal could learn. So careful observation helps debunk the myths. And if we get really serious about learning to live with wolves, we can hopefully learn what you might call etiquettes. So etiquettes are habits practices, behaviors that allow for coexistence with wolves. And so maybe we can learn etiquettes for coexisting with wolves. So just to go back to the question I asked about 6 or 7 slides ago, what does it take to live with wolves? Yes, it takes dogs to protect your livestock. It takes range riders. It takes education. It takes electric fences. But I submit that it also takes a philosophical change. This is a change for us, a change in values, ontology, worldview, epistemology, how we think about the world, what we know about the world, what we can learn from the world. It takes a change there as well. So that's one thing we learn from the wolf, and this is case study number 1. I have case study number 2 as well, but I'm just going to stop for a second. Does anybody want to ask any questions before I go to case study number 2?
On the Montana map, very far back, you had an orange block, kind of on the eastern side of current range of wolves. What did the orange block represent?
Oh yeah, what I meant to do there was to say, all right, how does Montana come into this story? Well, it comes into the story by looking at the places that wolves can start to spill out, and look at what we have to learn in those places if we're to learn how to cohabit with wolves. Now, some wolves have already spilled out from that block, but the block was really just to emphasize, you know, here's where the action is. Here's where the change in philosophy may or may not begin. Does that make sense now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That wasn't super well explained when I went through it first time. Okay, you ready for case study 2? Case study 2 is going to teach us quite a bit of what we learned in case study 1 from the wolf. But I think case study 2 can take us a little bit further even. I want to push us a little bit further philosophically. So case study 2 is the beaver. Up to 400 million beavers originally roamed North America, and that number was absolutely eviscerated, slashed into a fraction of what it was. By what? Do you know what led to those numbers going down? It was the fur trade. And you know what was the center of the fur trade? Was that item in the bottom in the middle there.
European hats.
Yep, the felt hat. And that felt hat was going off to Europe in the holds of cargo ships to such a degree that those beavers went from 400 million down to 100,000. In the center is the seal of the city of New York. I'd never looked at the seal of the city of New York until I got interested in beavers. The seal of the city of New York has 2 beavers on it. Can you see those? It's a little small probably from where you're looking, but you see the kind of windmill shapes in the middle of that? At the top and bottom of that windmill shape are beavers. If you go to Wall Street, where the stock exchange is today, one of the streets that butts into Wall Street is called Beaver Street. And that's because of the influence, the economic influence of beavers in the founding of New York and the initial sort of economic establishment of New York. Okay, so you get this massive beaver decline. The beaver catches a break. It catches a break not because we realized we shouldn't be killing beavers, but because hat fashions changed. So instead of wearing hats made out of beaver felt, Europeans started wearing hats made out of Chinese silk. So this really is as much of a tragedy as what was happening before, if you think about it. It wasn't that people realized we shouldn't be killing beavers. It's that hat fashions changed. But anyway, the beaver caught a break, and the beaver started getting reintroduced in the US starting in the 1920s. Some of those reintroductions were very interesting in the backcountry in Idaho, they wanted to get some beavers back up in the mountains there. It's kind of a lot of effort to haul a beaver up in a cage, so they parachuted them out of airplanes. And you can see these crates beneath these parachutes. Those crates hold beavers. When the crate hit the ground, it would pop open if they were lucky, and the beaver would just kind of go waddling out. Or if they didn't pop open, the beaver would sit there and would gnaw its way out. You know, I mean, if you're a beaver, what are you going to do but gnaw your way out of a wooden cage? So beavers started to repopulate the United States starting in the 1920s, and numbers really started to recover in the 1950s and 60s and onwards. Quick visit to Europe. Europe started getting serious about reintroducing beavers in around the year 2000 with some of their habitat directives. Now, look at the recovery. So initial number, I mentioned the United States, 400 million, down to a low point of 100,000. In Europe, the low point was 1,000. Where we're at today is 15 million in North America and 1.2 million in Europe. And you know, both recoveries are spectacular. But look at that European recovery, 1,000 times the low point in Europe, more than 1,000 times the low point. And a quick European map, look at the extension of the range. So beavers remained in those dark brown areas and they pushed out into the lighter brown areas. And I'm gonna add a little spot to this map in a second. I've got to tell you where to look for this spot. This was 2 weeks ago. So the reintroductions are still happening. And I grew up here on the south coast of England. I grew up there. Watch the map. 2 weeks ago, beavers got reintroduced pretty much into my hometown area. Next time I get to go to England, I'm very excited at this idea of beavers returning to this part of England. Yeah, actually, I should make that clear, yeah. These are beavers that are brought in boxes. So whereas everything I said about the wolf was a spontaneous reintroduction, this is actually a deliberate one where people are putting them in boxes, taking them to various places. So yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, we want to learn something about these returning beavers. What can we learn? Well, first, let's say a couple of things about the beaver itself. Fascinating animal, world's second largest rodent. Self-sharpening teeth. Does anybody know how a beaver can have self-sharpening teeth? It's really interesting. So, you know, beavers have pretty orange teeth. So the orange is iron, and the orange is in the front of the tooth. So when you look at, if a beaver smiles at you, you'll see these two giant orange incisors, which they use to, you know, chow down on the tree trunks. But behind those incisors, there is not as much iron in the tooth. So it's a softer tooth. So every time that beaver eats something hard, the part of the tooth behind wears away, and the part of the tooth in front stays intact. And so you have a constantly self-sharpening tooth that beaver can keep on eating wood with. And they will grow, those teeth will keep growing up to 4 feet a year. And if you ever see a beaver skull, you can see those teeth back up in the skull. They're just sort of, it's like the endless production of tooth material. Semi-opposable fingers, so they don't have thumbs. You know, we're pretty clever because we have thumbs. So beavers don't have thumbs, but they do have a fifth finger that can kind of grip things. You know, so you'll see a beaver holding a piece of wood, which makes it a pretty clever animal, really, without a thumb. They mate for life. The kits stick around for a couple of years to help the next year of kits. So wolf pups do this too. Wolf pups stick around. And so, you know, think if you're a wolf being born to an alpha pair, as well as being looked after by the alpha pair and a couple of uncles and aunts, you also have some siblings who've stuck around. And that's kind of nice, right? You know, it's nice to have siblings. beavers benefit from siblings too. So a nice kind of social unit, a beaver family. And they have this amazing multi-purpose tail, which serves all kinds of purposes. It's like it's a rudder, right? So when it's swimming, you can use your tail as a rudder. It's a heat exchanger because it's got a lot of blood vessels in it, so you can give off excess heat in the summer. It's a fat storage device, so good for the winter. You get that beaver tail really kind of fattened up for the winter. It's a tripod. You know, if you want to stand on your hind legs, you stick your tail out and you've got a tripod, so that's great. You can stand up and feel confident you won't fall over. And it's an alarm call. You know, that tail can slap down against the water in cases of alarm. So really sort of interesting type of animal. Let's start to get a little philosophical. Okay, so what does it take to live with beavers? We can tell a similar story to what we told with the wolf. It takes a bunch of interesting techniques and careful kind of practices to stop certain culverts from getting plugged up, because beavers are really good at plugging culverts, and that's bad for roads. So you have to create things they call beaver deceivers, which prevent the culvert from getting plugged up because you have a pipe that's constantly letting water out through the culvert. You have pond levelers, which does the same thing. It allows water to escape through a dam so that the pond doesn't rise and flood an area that you don't want flooded. And occasionally you have to live trap beavers. So there's organizations like People and Carnivores that are devoted to helping people live with beavers. And you have people like Bryce Andrews. So this is someone called Alexa Whipple, who works for the Methow Beaver Project in Washington. Is anybody here from the state of Washington? So the Methow Valley has this very well-respected beaver cohabitation organization called the Methow Beaver Project. So Alexa Whipple is the aquatic rodent equivalent of Bryce Andrews. So you've got all these practical things you can do, but there's the philosophical things, right? And again, this is where I want to really focus. The philosophical things you can do. Tearing down that dualism, recognizing animacy, recognizing culture, observing, learning etiquettes for cohabitation. But now I want to push this a little further, because I think the beaver has more lessons for us, perhaps, than the wolf. Let's push it further. What else can a beaver do? The ecosystem services provided by beavers are immense. They filter water, they recharge the groundwater, they store water for the summer, they stop nutrients flooding out into bays and oceans, they create complex habitat, they control floods. And part of the reason they're bringing beavers back to the UK is beavers could save Britain from flooding. So in a time of climate change, here in Montana, you know, we're going to suffer from a lot of fires. Where I grew up, we're going to suffer from a lot of floods, because you've got all that Atlantic Ocean where increased temperatures is putting more moisture into the atmosphere. The first land it gets to is England. So England gets dumped on with rainstorms. Beavers are going to mitigate some of that flooding potential. Let's come back out west, though, and talk about climate change. Beavers help us adapt to climate change. They store water, they create more forage, they create fire breaks. Beaver habitat sequesters a lot of carbon. So the ecosystem services that beavers provide, it's not just healthy ecosystems, it's climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. But it doesn't stop there. Beavers can also help us recover injured fish populations, like salmon populations. This photo was sent to me by Alexa Whipple. So I visited her in September to learn about beavers, and she told me the habitat these beavers create is incredible. And I said, what about the salmon? Don't the beavers kind of get in the way of salmon? Because beavers build dams, right? And salmon don't like dams. She said, no, that's not the case, actually. Beavers are helpful to salmon. And she said, 2 days after you left, we caught this picture on our camera at night. And look at what's going on in this picture. There is the flow device here. So that flow device was stopping that little creek, that little pond from spilling over and damaging the neighbor's property. you've got a beaver swimming by, and you've got two coho salmon swimming right under the beaver, just happy as a fish can be. Beavers provide salmon good habitat, and the types of services they provide for salmon, and for trout for that matter, is the complexity, the insect production. They actually moderate the pH of the water. So this is an interesting connection. In a wildfire, you get a lot of ash in the creek. And that ash in the creek creates a pH change. The beaver dam can store the ash behind the dam and moderate the pH change. So they're good for the pH of the water, sediment, flow, shelter, keeping temperatures down. Beavers do a lot for salmon. So, to bring this home, beavers give us a lesson in humility. We can learn a lot from beavers about how to be humble. Beavers give us a lesson in partnership. So climate change is a problem for us. Sure, it'd be nice if we had some partners helping us with that problem. Beavers can help us with that problem. And beavers can teach us things. They can teach us how to improve the quality of creek water through beaver dams. So these are what they call beaver dam analogs. On the bottom right there is a PhD student from the School of Forestry here, Andrew Lahr, who has an experiment. This is up on, just up Lolo Creek, up Highway 12, where he's building these beaver dam analogs. So that means like a fake beaver dam. And he's studying exactly how much that helps the water and what that does for fish. And it doesn't look like much of a creek, but there's actually plenty of trout in that creek. And these beaver dam analogs are hopefully creating better conditions for those trout. So, humility, partnership, apprenticeship. Beavers teach us this, as well as whatever else they teach us about animacy, individuality, culture. They teach us humility, partnership, and apprenticeship. And this is my prompt for going up to the Blackfeet Nation and for looking at the Sixtaki project, where those lessons are being reinvigorated and being brought back to high school students and Blackfeet youth interested in relearning or reinvigorating that relationship with the beaver. And they're doing it through, some of the same things that Andrew Lahr is doing up on the creek there. Beaver dam analogs, those are beaver dam analogs. And also creating these flow devices and beaver deceiver devices to help people cohabit with beavers. And what the Blackfeet bring to this that you don't get, let's say, in a settler culture, what the Blackfeet bring to this is a worldview primed for good relationships with returning wildlife. Okay, so what's clear is that the worldview is already in place for the kinds of relationships that can sustain recovering wildlife. And I don't know if you surfed around on that page that I sent you to look at to do with this project up with the Blackfeet, but it talks about the Blackfeet prayer bundle, the beaver bundle. It talks about the Blackfeet history with the beaver and how they did not participate in harvesting beavers to sell to settlers. And it talks about the role of the beaver in Blackfeet culture. So if we're looking for a worldview change, and that's what I'm suggesting rewilding can do for you, not only do you have this worldview that starts to think about partnership and humility and apprenticeship, if you add the component brought by indigenous people like the Blackfeet, you have a worldview that includes, in addition to partnership, humility, apprenticeship, attitudes like honor, gratitude. Why would you not be grateful for what the beaver does for you? And a recognition of a shared origin or a shared past or a shared story. So to return to the question that I had right at the beginning, what else does it take to live with wildlife? Yes, it takes practices like fences and beaver deceivers and flow devices and sheepdogs if we're talking about wolves. But what it also takes is a worldview change, a change in values, a change in epistemology. And so you get rid of Descartes and you key into some of the insight and appreciation that you find in indigenous cultures. So wrapping it up here, I just talked about the wolf and the beaver because those are two really interesting cases of rewilding. But in Montana, you can expand that story about as far as you want to go. You can talk about the grizzly bear, you can talk about the pronghorn, you can talk about the swift fox, the lynx, the bison, the fisher. There are all these possible rewilding stories that have philosophical lessons to teach. And so if I was the geologist naming these epochs, the old way of naming these epochs was to say, well, we had the Pleistocene and the Holocene, and then we blew it, and we ended up in the Anthropocene. Or if you want to be really depressed, we end up in the synthetic age. But I think we can tell a different story, different narrative, which it starts in the Pleistocene and the Holocene. Then we go through this period of incredible losses of animals. But then maybe we emerge out of that period of loss and we emerge into a period of recovery and rewilding, where a new relationship with animals develops. And this is my final line, Montana is the place where we can showcase that new relationship. So I think that's all I got. Happy to take any questions.
We usually give the first question options to the introducers. So Abigail and Mark, do you guys have questions you want to get us started with? And I'll bring the other mic back out here.
Okay, so for first lecture of this course, Professor Doug Emlin talked about Pleistocene rewilding in North America, which I don't know if are you familiar with?
I know a little bit about it, yeah.
Okay, so he talked about how it was a plan to restore large megafauna that went extinct 13,000 years ago by introducing proxies of these species from Africa, such as elephants and lions. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this extension of rewilding are, and do you think that it's realistic? And if not, are there any like circumstances in which you think it would be justified?
Yeah, so Pleistocene rewilding is sort of like this rewilding, but jacked up on steroids, because you're talking about bringing back creatures that were here 10, 50, 100,000 years ago. Often they don't exist anymore, so you have to bring in proxies, surrogate species. So they won't be exactly the same species, but it could be something that provides the approximate ecological role. It's a tricky one. So recovering ecological conditions is really important. And you do need certain species to recover those ecological conditions. So I did a phone interview with a Dutch guy who is, get this is really interesting. He's back breeding something that will be close to the extinct auroch. So an auroch was an original, it's the original cow, basically. All cows are descended from aurochs. The aurochs are extinct now. What this guy is doing is he's trying to back breed something like an auroch. So you mix cows that have these wild traits, and you keep mixing wild traits from cows until you have something like an auroch. And I said to him, This is a little bit sort of bold, isn't it? Like wanting to bring aurochs back. I said, why didn't you just let horses graze there? Or what do you say to somebody who says it's perfectly fine just to have sort of a few deer and a couple of contemporary cattle there? What do you say to that person? And he replied, what I say to that person is, you don't know what a specialist feeder an auroch was. So this is my anecdote to answer your question, Abigail. There are cases where you do need a very specific animal to perform the function. And if you don't have that very specific animal, you simply don't get the function. And we don't have the woolly mammoth or the mastodon anymore. So that means we don't have an herbivore that takes down trees, because that's what woolly mammoths and mastodons did. So we don't have that herbivore. And so the elephant, the Pleistocene rewilder says, the elephant would take down trees and would occupy that same kind of niche. So it's bold, it's controversial. I like the fact that it's ecology driven. I think that's sort of exciting about that sort of Pleistocene rewilding. But I think in terms of the need to restore biodiversity, there is a whole heck of a lot that we could and should do first before taking that step. It sort of seems like that step is sort of all the way to the sort of goal line in one leap, instead of doing the immense amount of things we could do right now. So I think I would want to go on record as saying, I'm not in favor of Pleistocene rewilding right now. Let's do what we need to do, the easiest stuff first. And then we'll have another conversation 50 years from now. Thanks for the question.
Well, I had a written question, but you brought up something that wasn't touched on. There was a large, dense population above the Black Sea of wolves on one of your maps, but it appeared that they had not migrated over the Urals into Russia. Anyway, I was more convinced. Why is it so dense? Was there never any depopulation, or is that a different breed?
Yeah, so good question. They were and are in Russia. The map just stopped there. The study was essentially of European countries, and it excluded places further east. They are there further east. But it's a good question. Why were those wolves so dense? How did they survive? I think there's two answers. One is that the development in those places was never as intense as the development in places like the Netherlands, and Germany, and France. And so, wolves were more effectively wiped out in those Western European countries than they were the further east you get. There's a political reason as well. Not many people in this room will remember the Cold War, but some of us were around for the Cold War, and the Cold War had a big sort of geopolitical boundary between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, the power was in the hands of dictators in countries like Romania and Hungary. And some of these dictators liked to go hunting on the weekends. And one of the worst of these was Ceausescu from Romania, who established these enormous hunting preserves just for his own enjoyment. And the people were kept out of these places by the sort of authoritarian nature of the communist regimes. And they were kept intact for the pleasure of the dictator like Ceausescu. Now that was horrible for the people, but it was fantastic for the wildlife. And so Romania, for example, has always had a strong population of wolves. And those wolves have been part of the source population that has allowed this spread that's happened in the last 2 decades. So there's a geopolitical answer there, as well as the sort of fact that historically there was more land, less people, which gave those wolves more of a chance.
Well, that nearly segues into my written question, which is where do we draw the line between human habitation and wildlife habitation? I believe she's right.
Sorry, hi, thank you for coming to speak to our class. My question is, are there dangers in quantifying an animal's solar consciousness in only ways we as humans can relate to, and how else can we draw conclusions about animal consciousness?
So there are dangers in projecting human qualities onto the animal world. One of the dangers, which I think is the one you're getting at, is that we limit our understanding of animals if we sort of say, well, the best they can do is these things that humans can do. I mean, we'd be making a lot of progress if we got that far. You know, if we got as far to say that these animals are individuals, are personalities, are social, can communicate like we can. If we got that far, we'd be doing pretty well, but we'd still be limiting them because we wouldn't be appreciating the other things that those animals can do on their own terms. And you might be familiar in environmental philosophy, there's a term that people have used to capture that idea. Instead of talking about the non-human world, they talk about the more than human world. And that term serves the purpose of not limiting animals. You know, saying these animals are not just non-human, they are more than human. They have more than what we have. So if you accept that animals can have more than what we have, then that, you know, prevents you from being too limiting. And you know, the question is, well, how do we know how much consciousness they have? I mean, you know, there's techniques that people in fields that I'm not in have developed to try and assess the degree of animal consciousness, and there's some really interesting stuff there. Mark Bekoff in Colorado is well known for his work on animal consciousness. Carl Safina is another person well known for his work. There's really interesting work on humpback whales and their communication done by scientists in Alaska. So yeah, even when you ask the question, how can we know how conscious they are? We could only ever know that in the terms that we understand consciousness, and that's never going to be enough. The terms under which we understand animal consciousness are never going to reach far enough to provide a full picture.
Yeah, I just had a question about the philosophy that you're talking about with Descartes. Do you think that our worldview and culture would have still gone in the same direction that it did if they never became popular? Like, do you think someone else would have taken that place, or do we just have no idea?
Like if Descartes had never been there?
Yeah.
That's sort of a good question. Like, you know, could you rewrite the Western intellectual tradition and just do a better job of it or something like that? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. That's a good question. I can't answer that question very well. You know, it's difficult to answer what might have been had it been different. I mean, one thing I want to say for Descartes, so Descartes' an easy person to put up there and say, oh, Descartes, what a fool. He got this so wrong. We need to get rid of Descartes. Descartes was reaching for the idea that it sure feels like there's a world out there that's physical, and then there's a world inside here that's mental. You know, like I'm standing here right now, and it kind of feels like that. You know, it kind of feels like I'm here inside my head thinking about the words that I'm going to say, and that you're all out there doing your thing, sitting at tables, writing with pens on books. And so if someone walks into the room who happens to be called Rene Descartes and says, hey, you know what? There's mental substance inside and there's physical substance outside. You're going to say, yeah, it kind of feels like that. It kind of does. So I don't think it's fair to say Descartes got it so wrong. And if we were doing it over, we would never make those same mistakes again. I kind of feel like we might have made some of those same mistakes again. What I think we wouldn't do, well, I hope we wouldn't do again, is the brutal and violent way in which people acting in the name of the philosophies of people like Descartes and Bacon colonized, settled, and perpetrated violence upon indigenous people across the world. It's not just in North America, it's across the world. So the way that worldview was set up to exploit, destroy, and kill, that was extraordinary. And so let's hope if there was a do-over, that wouldn't happen again, because that was, apart from the sheer inhumanity of it, the neglect of the insights and knowledge and wisdom that was a consequence of that colonial mindset. What a loss. What a loss. And, hopefully there's still time to sort of take some steps back and undo some of that loss. And I think we should all think of that as a priority. So I don't know, what might history have looked like if it had been different? It's just hard to say, isn't it?
Christopher, we're near the end of our time, and I wanted to slip in one more just to see if you get what your response might be. One of the things that I think coming from not only Descartes, but just the long, long history of the Western tradition, from the biblical view and stuff, is so often the starting point was human exceptionalism. And so we just start off with an assumption of what makes humans distinct, and then everything else is sort of out there. And I so appreciate you bringing us back to the philosophical and kind of the ontological or even epistemological ways, because I would argue that what we need to do is start the opposite and instead of being fearful about projecting human stuff onto things, start with what I call mammalizing. We're all mammals, and we have a lot, and we have a lot of shared heritage, evolutionary heritage as mammals, and those then take very, very distinctive shapes, whether it's a whale or a beaver or wolf, things like that. But there's incredible degrees of continuity that simply come from sharing mammalness there that we can use then to, and that's again, no, we can't know fully what consciousness was going to look like in a whale or consciousness going to look like in a wolf, but we can see continuity in a lot of these different relationships simply because we're all mammals and we come from different lines. Those have developed very distinctive ways. But I think sometimes if we start with the continuity first and then look for the distinctiveness, as opposed to always starting from human exceptionalism and then everything else is out there, that in some ways to me feels like a more promising way to move.
Yeah, and you'll be familiar, Dan, with the word anthropomorphism. And so if you accuse somebody of being an anthropomorphist, that's an insult, because you're saying, oh, you're just projecting human characteristics onto the non-human world. You're saying that wolf mother is courageous and the honorable, and you're just projecting, courage and honor is something that humans have. Well, let's rethink that. Let's rethink whether anthropomorphism is a bad thing to do. Maybe courage and honor is exactly what that wolf is showing. There's a continuity, right? It's the same trait that the human shows. And so instead of thinking of anthropomorphism as a mistake, we could think of it as something we should be doing more of. And I don't know, Abigail is in my other class. Do you remember in class a couple of weeks ago, we had a wildlife bio student say, well, I've been told not to personalize animals, that it's dangerous to personalize animals and talk about them as, give them names and give them characters. And I was quite surprised to hear that because, here we are in 2021 and people are still being taught it's dangerous to personalize animals. That really surprised me. I mean, I understand, if you're practicing science, there's aspects of the scientific method that require you to be detached. That's what the method is to sort of observe in a detached way. But to say that it's dangerous to personalize animals, I thought that was kind of surprising. I don't know if you remembered that, Abigail, but it was an interesting remark. I think it's probably pretty healthy to personalize animals. It's probably a good thing to do, to think of animals as personalities and individuals. So that's a change I'd like to see.
Christopher, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time here, but just want to really thank you so much for a really, really thought-provoking and really interesting conversation for us tonight. So let's give Christopher a warm welcome here.
Thank you, sir.
Yep, thanks for listening, everybody. Enjoyed it.
And we'll invite Christopher possibly to join us again on Thursday for further conversation. We'll talk about that, but thanks very much. Let me go